On June 2nd and 3rd, 2011, the Center for Design and Geopolitics held its first annual conference in La Jolla at Cal IT2, the California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego.
So the next speaker, Kelly Gates, is a new friend of mine. I was recently speaking at the Guardian, the British newspaper, has an annual conference they do every year in New York, and I was up there and I did a talk. And after my talk, I was speaking with Evgeny Morozov, author of Net Delusion, and the strong contrarian voice in the all of the optimism around the social media revolutions in the Middle East, but a very interesting fellow. And I told him I was at UC San Diego, and we were talking about the work. He says, "Oh, well, do you know Kelly Gates?" And I said, I felt kind of embarrassed. I don't know Kelly Gates. I said, well, she's just written a book on facial recognition software. That's one of the best books I've ever read, and he's writing this. Have been writing a review of this. So I said, well, I better figure out who Kelly Gates is and get to meet her, which I did, which I immediately did. And very pleased to have her join us here today. Having looked at the book, I think Evgeny may be right. Kelly's major research interests are new media, science and technology studies, cultural policy studies. She studies the social dimensions of new media technologies, their institutional and cultural histories, and how various forms and uses of new media both support and challenge existing institutions, cultural practices, and new ways of communicating. She's here in UC San Diego's Department of Communication. So perhaps to Lev's question about the humanities and the way and the production of data, perhaps the question of the way in which we produce the data about the human will be the way in which to square the circle. So with that, Kelly.
So what I want to talk about today as a contribution to the discussion of geogovernance and design issues is the problem of security, continuing a discussion that was started by some of the speakers already, but taking it in a different direction. Security is often conceptualized as a design problem, whether we're talking about urban design, airport design, software design, or other kinds of design projects that are concerned with building in security measures. Security is also conceptualized as a problem of data analysis or data visualization, identifying threats to security by harnessing the power of computation. Of course, security is more than a design problem or a problem of data analysis. It's also a political problem and certainly a geopolitical problem, which is why I titled my talk The Geopolitics of the Face, and I'm being a little provocative there, but we'll see if it holds up. So particular ways of conceptualizing security shape the domain of geopolitics, and the politics of security are very much part of its design. So I'm interested in this, in how security as a political issue and security as a design issue are intertwined and mutually constituted. So I just want to kind of explain my thinking about this. One of the predominant ways of conceptualizing security in the domain of geopolitics is the realist security position, or what is sometimes referred to as the neo-realist position, to distinguish the post-Cold War version. This is essentially the militaristic Hobbesian view that defines security as the responsibility of self-interested states, and states are charged with protecting their citizens, territories, and infrastructures from external and internal threats. So this view is, one everyone is familiar with, the national security view that, the way to provide national security is to build up military apparatus, to have strong border and immigration controls, and of course to identify internal threats by monitoring the population. And there's a similar kind of realist position in policing and criminology, which holds that the way to provide security to the community is to give the police lots of power and surveillance capabilities, and to give the justice system the authority to mete out punishments and incarcerate individuals deemed to be threats to the community. So I kind of want to be clear that I'm not an advocate of the realist security position. I think that one of the major problems with this way of approaching security is that it depends fundamentally on applying a politics of inclusion and exclusion, on systematic efforts to make determinations about who belongs and who does not, who is entitled to security and who poses a threat to security. So we can recognize this as a problem of the realist security paradigm, but I don't think we can be naive to the practical realities that make the realist position make sense. There's a reason why it's called the realist position, and a reason why it's successful on some level. If you incarcerate enough people, crime rates might just go down, even when there's a recession. So this approach to security does protect some people, but it does not necessarily provide more people with more security, especially if we're thinking of security on a global scale. What it is tending to do is to treat everyone as a potential security threat. So in the exceptional circumstances of the war on terror, any of us can be designated a threat at any time. And once designated as a threat, stripped of our rights, including our right to challenge the designation of ourselves as a threat. So, in other words, one becomes what Agamben has called homo caesar, a person who is biologically still alive but legally dead. So I guess if I were to make a broad programmatic statement, which Benjamin encouraged me to do, I would say that any discussion of geogovernance needs to think carefully about this question of security and how security is conceptualized and designed. I would love to say let's just jettison the realist security paradigm, but in favor of a global ecological or global human rights orientation to security, but I'm not under the illusion that that's something that we can just do. But I do want to start by raising the question of how a radical rethinking of geogovernance is going to deal with this issue of security. It's not an easy question. Okay, so what does this have to do with my research and the theme of this panel, which is data as world image, and world making? I want to focus for the remainder of my time on some of the ideas in my book, which came out from NYU Press in February. Here's some shameless self-promotion. It's titled Our Biometric Future, and it addresses precisely this issue of human classification and the way a security paradigm based on a politics of inclusion and exclusion harnesses the power of computation. This is not the theme of the entire book. It's really a focus of probably two of the chapters, which is where I've two chapters I've cribbed for this particular talk. So in the book, I focus on the computational analysis of the face. I examine the effort underway since the 1960s to program computers to see the human face. So to do this, I look at two separate but related technological efforts. One is to design computer programs that can identify individual faces and distinguish them from one another. And the other is to develop programs that can analyze facial expressions as a means of deciphering what individuals are thinking and feeling. So for me, the face is important. It has been and continues to be a special object of attention in the development of visual media technologies. And the techniques designed for representing and analyzing the face have historically played a special role in defining categories of human identity. So as I argue in the book, the computational analysis of the face is very much in keeping with this history. Okay, so to elaborate a bit on the first issue of facial recognition technology and the problem of identification, I want to go back about 1 month to the killing of Osama bin Laden. And in fact, long before his assassination, the identification of bin Laden was a special problem for the state. So every time a video, one of his videos or audio recordings surfaced, there would be a lot of speculation about whether in fact it was him or how to verify that it was him, how recently it was recorded, and especially speculation about whether in fact he might already be dead and this was recorded earlier. And all of this attention to verifying bin Laden's identity and his presence in these recordings derived partly, largely, from the fact that the man himself, his body, he was physically missing. Bin Laden was known to the U.S., in the U.S., only by his media presence. And this doesn't really make him that much different than any other media celebrity. I've never been in the physical presence of Barack Obama or a lot of other political figures, except that the U.S. was searching for his physical presence and unable for years to find him, to locate him. So Jonathan Stern addresses this point in an essay where he examines the state's effort to verify bin Laden's voice in audio recordings using digital voice print analysis. So voice printing is a technique that's more suitable for probability than certainty, according to Stern. Anyone familiar with voice verification technologies knows that this isn't as simple as it seems. Bin Laden's voice could never be verified for certain from these recordings. So there are important differences between recordings of bin Laden's voice, which were rare, and images of his face, which were ubiquitous, especially after 9/11. And Jonathan Stern spends a lot of time talking about the suppression of bin Laden's voice and comparing it to the ubiquity of his face. But both voice print analysis and facial recognition technologies share some important characteristics. So neither can verify for certain an identity. Neither can provide 100% certainty. Both are more suitable for probability than certainty. And more importantly, both have been put forward by the state as a means of providing evidence that verifies bin Laden's identity in lieu of his physical body. So when U.S. forces killed bin Laden, the identification of his body was a political priority for the state. As the media reported, the U.S. used multiple methods to identify his remains. One was through old-fashioned face-to-face human perception. So both the U.S. operatives who stormed his compound and a woman who was believed to be one of his wives visually identified bin Laden using their own facial recognition capabilities. And this is actually really two separate kinds of human face identification, because the men who, or the commandos who killed bin Laden would have not likely have ever been in his physical presence before, so they were using photographs of him to make a comparison and identify him that way. And so it's significant that the state also mentioned that they had this woman who likely had been in his physical presence as another identifier. The second way that his remains were identified was DNA analysis. So this is considered the ultimate identifier. A DNA sample derived from his dead body was compared with DNA samples from his some of his known relatives. And then the third way was with facial recognition technology. So according to NBC News, the CIA's facial recognition technology identified bin Laden's face with 95% certainty after comparing it to known pictures of him. So I found this really interesting. Why the need for these multiple methods of identification? And why facial recognition technology in addition to human face recognition and DNA analysis? And one answer, just simply put, is that, again, we have no body. Just as we experienced bin Laden's liveness only by his media presence, we also experienced his death this way. And these multiple forms of identification are supposed to amount to more evidence and more certainty of both his identity and his death. Here, the state is relying on forms of data analysis and the authority of that analysis to provide the evidence that it needs to, in order to have claimed to have killed him, to have killed this enemy of the state. Okay. So, facial recognition technology received an enormous amount of attention in the press and in policy discussions after 9/11. And so, in this sense, it seems appropriate that it would be used as one of the means of identifying bin Laden's body. So the post 9/11 interest in facial recognition started with this regretful yet strangely promising claim. And this was the claim that had the technology been in place in airports, it might have identified some of the hijackers and prevented one or more of the attacks. So you could hear this claim. This claim was made repeatedly, especially by people with a financial interest, but also by policymakers and other public voices. And it was usually made along with references to this image, which appears to show Mohammed Atta and Abdulaziz Al-Amari passing through airport security on the morning of 9/11. So the people would reference this image and suggest that had facial recognition technology been in place, it would have been able to identify these men as they passed through airport security. And if anyone here knows about this technology, and you can look at this image, you can recognize that that's a problematic claim. One of the goals of my book, in fact, is to show that this was a problematic claim for many reasons. In fact, I begin the book by asking what would have to happen to make this claim a reality. And what was interesting to me about using facial recognition to identify bin Laden's body is that it's as if the technology had finally fulfilled this bogus promise, the promise to identify the face of terror. Or in the words of a Times op-ed piece by John Poindexter, to find the face of terror in data. This headline and other statements like it that circulated after 9/11 conveyed the image, it just conveyed this idea of the world as a field of data to be mined for information about terrorist identities. In the process of going about their activities, terrorists have left these traces of their presence in the parallel world of data. So the business of finding the face of terror in data is a very different thing than verifying the identity of a single body. Answering the question, is this man who we think he is a relatively simple matter of conducting a one-to-one comparison, matching a known photograph of bin Laden with a photograph taken of his face on the scene. So, but identifying individuals as they pass through the view of a surveillance camera is really another matter, and identifying thousands of individuals passing in front of thousands of video cameras is another matter entirely. As a technical design problem, answering the question, is this person who we think he is more practical than answering, is any one of these hundreds of thousands of people a terrorist? And answering this latter question would require constructing a massive machinery of surveillance, or what Virilio calls a logistics of military perception. In Virilio's view, machine vision technologies have a frightening tendency to see the world with an eye for bloodshed. He shows how the technologies of war and cinema have been co-produced historically. Together, these war and cinema have enabled the visual augmentation of military perception, as well as the mobilization of societies, the militarization of societies and their mobilization for war. I think it's safe to say that in its application for terrorist identification, facial recognition technology is in keeping with Virilio's theory of military perception. So here, facial recognition systems are envisioned and designed to support a military perceptual apparatus, and one that aims to keep targets perpetually in sight. Most of the funding for this technology has come from the U.S. military, and they're interested in this business of marrying identification at a distance with killing at a distance. So at the center of this effort, at least since 9/11, has been the construction of a terrorist watch list database. Building a better terrorist watch list has become a major priority. It was especially, it kind of ebbs and flows in terms of the amount of political energy that's invested in it, and has had the effort to really build a consolidated database is what I examine in the book. And this of course, raises the question of the politics of terrorist classification and the terrorist classification system. What criteria would be used to define the terrorist identity? And that sounds like a simple question, but again, it's not an easy question to answer. It's an ambiguous one. It's also a political question, as well as a question about the design of security systems. So part of my project in the book in general is to examine the role of the image database in the design of facial recognition systems. And in this case, to unpack the politics involved in designing a centralized terrorist watch list. So I examined the effort to merge the case management files of multiple agencies into one centralized database. And to its credit, the state itself, state agencies, the Department of Justice, they're the ones identifying the problems with this process through various audit reports. So that's how I learned about, that's how I discovered that this is a highly imperfect process, fraught with error and ambiguity. So there are many problems, and I'm not going to get into them, but one key problem that is worth mentioning is the kind of obvious one that imposing a unified coding scheme on a bunch of different agency case management files can't help but transform that information in the process. And so I think that one of the most problematic results of the watch list expansion and consolidation process has been the broadening designation of terrorist to include this very diverse array of problem identities. So watch list database consolidation, what it did in some ways is rendered the terrorist designation in technical form, instrumentalizing it as a matter of database management and consolidation as a technical procedure. Okay, so I'm just going to move right along here. I've spent some time, most of my time, talking about identification and facial recognition technology, but now I want to spend a little bit of time on the automation of facial expression analysis, or I'm going to use the acronym AFEA because it's too many syllables. So AFEA poses some similar and some very different kinds of questions. One of the reasons why facial recognition and other new ID technologies are being institutionalized is to address the problem of disembodied identities. This is what I alluded to in my discussion of bin Laden's body. Visual, textual, and coded representations of individuals obviously circulate independent of their physical bodies. And this is not a new problem, but it's obviously a greatly intensified problem. And I don't think I need to really explain why to this group. I'll just refer back to previous presentations like James Fowler's. Like facial recognition, AFEA, automated facial expression analysis, is another effort to address this problem. In this case, an effort to bring the body's affective dimensions into mediated interactions. This technology promises to accomplish what facial recognition technology fails to do, which is read the interior of the person off the surface of the face, using the face itself as a field of classifiable data about the individual. But just as facial recognition can never provide absolute certainty of identity, the computational analysis of facial expressions can't give us direct access to another person's emotions or fully reconcile self and other. So AFEA actually has a very wide range of applications for human-computer interaction, for autism therapy, for market research purposes. It's of special interest to psychologists studying facial expressions, especially those who are using, the facial action coding system. There's a coding system that they use to study facial expressions that involves manual coding. It's extremely labor-intensive and takes a long time, and so automating that would really help speed up their research, and so they're interested in it. So some of these uses are certainly beneficial to certain groups of people, but for me, I always like the problematic uses. One of the most interesting and problematic applications, especially in discussions of security, is its application for deception detection. So there's a lot that I could say about this, but I just will briefly note that what Melissa Littlefield argues about fMRI and detection is also true of AFEA. These newer kinds of, newer and seemingly more sophisticated, and they are more sophisticated forms of lie detection, but they are also very consistent with the history of lie detection, consistent with the polygraph, in that they depend on the measurement of physiological processes, and that those measurements can only ever provide an indirect, mediated, interpretive assessment of an individual's state of mind. They cannot provide direct access to the mind, nor, I would add, should they provide direct access to the mind. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up, and I want to wrap up by quoting Deleuze. Deleuze has written that all faces envelope an unknown, unexplored landscape, by which I'm sure he meant something really profound. I'm not Deleuzian, so I can't fully interpret it or adequately interpret it, but I do like the statement, and I think it points to a sense in which the face itself is a geopolitical domain or landscape. I think it is the case that in designing new technologies of vision, we're creating new kinds of machinic assemblages, and our subjective forms of visual perception are themselves being reinvented in the process. But unfortunately, I don't see, oftentimes this doesn't really lead to radically new ways of seeing the world. What seems to happen so often, at least in terms of the most capitalized applications of these technologies, is the reinforcement of certain dominant institutionalized modes of seeing. So the computational analysis of the face is being designed and applied, much like the physiognomic technologies of the past, for practices of human classification. And so it's being integrated into security systems designed to classify individuals into hierarchies of value and risk. And as I noted at the beginning, I think that this way of conceptualizing security and designing security is at odds with a more global human rights-oriented vision. But I want to end on a brighter note, and this article, there was some this article appeared in the New York Times right around when bin Laden was killed, and I was thrilled to see it. There's some promising evidence here that there may be some internal challenges to the realist security paradigm. So the New York Times recently reported on a paper written by 2 military strategists calling for a reorientation of security policy around issues of global sustainability. The U.S., quote, cannot continue to engage the world primarily with military force, according to the report, but must do so as a nation powered by the strength of its educational system, social policies, international development and diplomacy, and its commitment to sustainable practices in energy and agriculture. So my tendency is to be dismissive of this kind of posturing, but given, especially given the U.S. Record on these issues, but I think that the source and sentiment of this paper offers some hope that there might at least be some debate taking shape within the state security community itself over this issue of how to radically rethink security. Thank you.